capability to migrate from an insufficient capability to a more than adequate capability for an adversary right now is nothing.
Welcome everyone to the Industrial Security Podcast. My name is Nate Nelson. I'm here as usual with Andrew Ginter, Vice President of Industrial Security at Waterfall Security Solutions. He's going to introduce the subject and the guest of today's show. Andrew, how's it going?
I'm very well, thank you, Nate. Our guest today is Mark Fabro. He is the President and Chief Security Scientist at Lofty Perch. Our topic is probability versus capability. We're going to be talking about problems with how most people deal with the risk of cyber sabotage. And as you know, I'm working on my next book, and the topic of that book is managing OT cyber risk. And, I don't know about you, but I found this conversation very useful. In the time since we recorded, Mark and I wound up rewriting my chapter 6 to reflect a bunch of the stuff that Mark talked about with me. So I found this very useful. I hope you find the same thing.
All right. Then without further ado, here's you and Mark.
Hello, Mark, and thank you for joining us. Before we get started, can you tell us a few things about yourself and about the work that you do at Lofty Perch?
Sure. Well, thank you, Andrew, for having me. It is always a pleasure to talk to you, my friend. Lofty Perch is an organization that was founded in 2005, specific to control system cybersecurity. So it's the only thing we've ever done, and we haven't deviated from that market. And that's been a very interesting journey, obviously. Since 2005, we've had the opportunity to be involved in the development of many of the contemporary standards the world is recognizing now as best practices with regards to operational technology and control system cybersecurity. And in our organization, we provide a pretty comprehensive library of services, all of which are assessment focused, whether they are doing tactical analysis and architecture reviews to create use cases and scenarios to help customers really identify the risk as it relates to their industrial automation environments, integrated systems, interdependencies. And then we also do very extensive, comprehensive cybersecurity assessments where our customers depend on us to model the capabilities of significant, well-funded adversaries with intent. So we provide a gambit of services specific to helping customers really understand the cyber risk landscape of their mission-critical infrastructure, specifically industrial automation.
So, Mark, our topic today is risk and how we calculate it. And, the classic formula is what's the probability of a risk event occurring, like a tornado, and what's the average cost of a tornado event. It's, $10 million. It takes the building down. You multiply the two. So, look at, what is the probability of a cyber attack, targeting a large generator and triggering an Aurora-style event on the generator because they've sabotaged all of the relays and, physically destroying, 4 steam turbines and their associated generators. What's the probability? Well, we know it's not 0 because nothing's ever perfectly secure. But if we give it a number, and we go to the board and say, we have a probability here, we have an impact, we multiply the two, it looks really bad, we need money to prevent this. They're going to look at you and go, where did you get that probability from? You made that up, didn't you? They see through things like this. So is this the right way to think about OT cyber risk?
I don't think it does. I've always been a proponent of not using actual numerical values to talk about risk and probability of something happen. I mean, in your analysis there where you're saying the attacker is going to get in and they have done this and this is what they've done and things like that. Well, the probability is 1 because they've done it. Organizations really like to understand probability, and they're constantly craving actual numbers and metrics associated with risk. In cyber, the thing is that we're the metrics that we're actually looking at, the characteristics and attributes of what makes up the threat, change the game and actually, I believe, move us away from any reliability we should have in actual numbers. I mean, the threat is itself
a person, an actor that has characteristics and attributes, and they have capability and opportunity and intent. So I don't actually think that assigning real hard numerical values to probability is useful. I think you can assign low, medium, high areas of risk, but the smarter we get about what the adversary is doing and capable of, combined with our knowledge of what conditions need to be met for the adversary to be successful, I don't think we should be relying, or I don't think we should really find comfort in being able to present numerical values about probability of something happen when it comes to cyber specific events. It just, I don't think it's fair to the decision makers, and I don't think it's fair to the people that are responsible for really understanding the risk and providing the most appropriate countermeasures to it.
You know, Andrew, that is, it's a pretty interesting point that Mark is making there, but I'm not sure that I'm entirely convinced yet. I think that intuitively, most of us understand that probabilities, numbers, are limited tools. They can't describe the entirety of a situation that's occurring out in the real world. But if we recognize their limits, they can be a useful way of framing problems, no?
They can and they can't. Here's a couple of examples. If we talk tornadoes or earthquakes, even if these things occur very rarely at a certain location, there are statistics. You can look at history. You can come up and say, there's a serious earthquake in this geography about once every 150 years, on average, in the historical record, in the geologic record, and so you can use those numbers. And even in the cyberspace, when you have history, when you have numbers, you can use them. So, for example, common malware, something got onto the corporate network 73 times last year. We had to mobilize the incident response team 73 times and go clean it out. Those are numbers. It's likely to happen roughly that many times again in the future, unless something changes in either the threat environment or our defensive posture. So when you have numbers, by all means use them. One of the points that I'm making here and that he's making is you don't always have numbers. You can't make up numbers, and it gets worse than that. My next question is leading into, do the numbers even make any sense? So let's go back and see what Mark's got for us. So work with me. If we got, safety systems, they do deep math on random failures. Because, components fail, springs fail, welds on boilers fail eventually. When exactly they're going to fail is random. And so likelihood kind of makes sense for things like tornadoes and equipment failures. But when we're talking about deliberate attacks, if you're talking about, a terrorist attack, are you going to say, likelihood times consequence? Is that how you model terrorist attacks?
No, I don't. Some people do. I don't know where likelihood fits into that. I personally am not the subject matter expert that says let's use likelihood as a metric to calculate risk. I can't do that, especially in cyber when you're dealing about threats, because at least in my experience, the characteristics and attributes for the threat actor are just so incredibly dynamic, and getting into likelihood becomes crazy. I mean, I can say the likelihood of the first level port and service scan from the internet on an internet facing target by an adversary, the likelihood is high because it's the first step in the kill chain, or those scans are going to happen just because of the bots that are roaming around the internet to do it anyway, to populate various databases to find internet facing assets with port and service profiles on them. That is going to happen. The probability is, I could dare say it's almost one. Putting likelihood into the conversation about risk, I think, is hard. I don't know how to do it because I think that there are other elements that provide so much more intrinsic value as it relates to the conversation for mitigation, condition-based analysis, consequence-based analysis. Remember, we're having conversations with stakeholders that are probably from the engineering side, and they want to have a conversation to make sure that you are giving them voice to the concerns they have from an engineering perspective, and that's consequence analysis. I mean, some of them try and come and talk about the safety conversation, and there's credit to that. Because historically, we have safety analysis to be preventative maintenance, to proactively prepare for something to happen. There is a likelihood that some bolt or bearing is going to fail after a certain amount of time, so it's actually taken out before that time happens. That's how the safety conversation really happens. We don't have that with security because we're dealing with threats. This is not a safety issue. This is a security function. So I don't even know how you put the conversation of likelihood into the risk function, because I just don't know where it makes sense today. I knew where it made sense 10 years ago, because we were still trying to wrap our head around the conversation about consequence-based analysis and annualized loss expectancies from a dollar perspective for cyber systems. But that's changed. The people who are dealing with are so much smarter.
So it seems to me that the likelihood that you guys are talking about has to do with whether attacks succeed. And actually, Andrew, I've always assumed that that is a deterministic thing. What I assumed that probabilities are useful for has to do with the broader contextual factors around attacks. Who's attacking, when, what means they have. I'll give you an example. Any industrial or non-industrial organization of significant size in today's world is subject to ransomware attacks. There's a certain risk there. The question, though, is, will it be you? When will it be you? And then how do you adjust to that threat, right? If I'm running a large company, of course, the best decision logically is to defend myself now against ransomware. But if my finances are tight right now versus what they might be in 6 months, how likelihood could affect these decisions seems relatively important, no?
Yes. And so that's a good point. Risk is sort of, it's more complicated than the worst case. Let me answer your example. Let's say a manufacturing organization, a manufacturing organization that produces machines that are used by other manufacturers. It's not a critical infrastructure. Let's say the organization gets hit by ransomware, all their factories go down for a week. What happens? They lose a week's production. They have to clean out all their systems, restore from backups, and they're back up. They have to pay for the incident response teams. They lay their people off for a week. They draw unemployment for a week. They hire them back. They schedule extra shifts. They pay their people some overtime. They make up all of their lost production. By the end of the quarter, what's the impact on the company? It's a few $1 million in costs. And that's it. Okay, the customers still have their machines. It's all good. This is an acceptable loss. But if you've got an unacceptable loss, you take a pipeline down, or you take a power plant down, and there's damages, there's injuries, there's casualties. Even if these events occur infrequently, and you might say, oh, that's a low probability. If the event occurred in a sense entirely predictably, if this class of adversary, a ransomware group, comes after the target and they wind up causing these consequences, casualties, or serious impacts to the company, irrecoverable impacts, unacceptable consequences, is it enough for the company to say, they don't happen very often, so even though I knew we'd go down, this is the CISO talking, even though I knew we'd go down, I didn't do anything because we don't get attacked very often. Is that representing due care on the part of someone who's operating a powerful, dangerous physical process? Is that represent due diligence because you're not taking steps to defend yourself against widely available attack capabilities? Even if likelihood could figure into unacceptable consequences in the sense of target selection by ransomware groups, is it acceptable to rely on that is part of the question here. And I suggest for most people, when you have unacceptable consequences, they'll say, no, likelihood is the wrong way to model that kind of risk. And in fact, my next question on with Mark leads into, well, how do you deal with these kinds of threats? So let's get back to him and see what he's got for us.
So, Andrew, I think that you bring up a really good point. And I think that the security community is
So talk to me about deliberate attacks. I've heard a formula. Risk is consequence times threat times vulnerability. Is that a better model for deliberate attacks like cyber sabotage?
When you're trying to again, we're sitting in the box right now of cyber sabotage and deliberate attacks and things like this, and I believe that, contrary to popular opinion, some of these attacks that we've seen that have wreaked havoc within the industrial automation world haven't been entirely opportunistic. Some have been very, very targeted, but others have just been consequential. The consequence that actually happened was not the intent or the goal of the adversary. It was just a win, an unpredictable consequence that was a result of interconnected systems or some backdoor or some interdependent or transitive trust across a network that nobody really knew was there. And that's how something like ransomware spread. So to that extent, I think threat, vulnerability, and consequence are important. But with that, the elements of how you measure threat, vulnerability, and consequence become important, because in those elements themselves, there are measurable attributes that we need to understand, right? I mean, I believe that if you're looking at doing the analysis on a system, the most important thing to do is ascertain and understand the conditions that need to be met for that negative consequence to happen, whatever the negative consequence is. And to do that, you do the analysis that is informed by IT security, OT security, system designer, vendors, red team, pen testers, purple team, white team, whatever. And they get together and they actually figure out what are the conditions that need to be completed or met to accomplish this goal. And the information that comes from that gives you intrinsic insight into the elements that you actually can obtain information about. Right? We look at the adversary as an example. We like to talk about consequence. We look to talk about capability. We talk about opportunity, and we talk about intent. Right? Sometimes, if we say the intent is going to be the adversary's goal in a dedicated, intentional type of attack, we can figure out what the consequences or what the conditions need to be met to accomplish that. We use attack trees or cyber-informed engineering, and we could do it a bunch of different ways. The opportunities that are presented to the adversary ultimately become the vulnerabilities in our own system that need to be capitalized upon or exploited for steps within the kill chain to continue. And from that, you can pretty much derive what the capability of the adversary has to be to accomplish that intent using said vulnerabilities. We have control, Andrew, over understanding what our vulnerabilities are. We have control over understanding what the consequences need to be. We should be able to define the capabilities of the adversary itself, because then our job becomes to make it harder. We want to push the work effort for the adversary up so that they don't have enough capability, or the monetary investment to obtain the capability to overcome the countermeasures is greater than the value proposition of what it is they're trying to do.
Okay, so we're moving a little fast here. Let me dig into this just a bit. If risk is consequence times threat times vulnerability, can we just dig into vulnerability for a second? I mean, in common parlance, a vulnerability is a defect in the software. How do you fix it? You get a patch. You apply a security update. But when we talk about the classic risk of deliberate attacks, risk is consequence times threat times vulnerability. Are these software vulnerabilities that we're talking about?
Well, first of all, I think to create a box that says a vulnerability is a defect that, if capitalized on, would cause a negative consequence event, I think we have to revisit that a little bit. I mean, the problem is that you and I could sit there and clearly define what a vulnerability is, while at the same time, there's an entire population out there worried about the fact that unauthorized access to a system, and then someone maloperating that system in an undesirable way using legitimate elements, big red buttons or stop functions for PLCs, or resetting things only to read only, all of these kind of things. That's maloperation of legitimate functions that could create a negative consequence event. Is it a vulnerability? Is that a defect in the system? Well, no. So we have to be careful about how we're classifying vulnerabilities. And I think that's important in the bigger conversation, because for the longest time, we've been hung up in doing things like vulnerability management, and that vulnerability management has been done in absence of the other elements talking about risk. And we've done assessments where we have found significant vulnerabilities in systems, but the risk is actually low because of the conditions that need to be met for those vulnerabilities, whether they are quote unquote defects or whether they are legitimate actions that could be maloperated upon. The risk is actually low. So the vulnerability conversation actually becomes really important, and we need to kind of move forward in that way, because if we still want to think about vulnerabilities in the classical sense, we owe it to ourselves to include the other elements, the other measurement elements associated with, threat, vulnerability, and consequence, because we become more and more informed about the dynamics of that equation. But we need to be better informed about what vulnerability actually means. And vulnerability means different things to different types of adversaries, and it means different things in the terms of consequence. Vulnerability management programs that are, they are completely set on mitigating 100% of their vulnerabilities. Organizations spend a tremendous amount of money managing all those vulnerabilities, but yet they're not even related to any significant consequence. They have a goal saying, let's mitigate 100% of the vulnerabilities, and the cost associated with that greatly exceeds any consequence that would ever happen by the manipulation or the exploitation of those vulnerabilities, which would be, they become opportunities to certain classes of threat actors with certain types of goals in mind.
Nate, let me dive just a little bit deeper there. I agree with Mark, obviously, that the term vulnerability is very confusing. I mean, I see way too many people out there that run sort of a naive calculus that goes, vulnerability, risk is threat times vulnerability times consequence. Vulnerabilities are software vulnerabilities. So quick, patch everything. Now I have 0 known software vulnerabilities. Therefore I'm invulnerable, which is, of course, nonsense. There's 0 days, there's unknown vulnerabilities, there's stolen passwords, there's misconfigured systems. All of these are opportunities for the bad guys to attack us, even if they aren't software vulnerabilities. And some people use the term vulnerability to mean all of those attack opportunities, but most people don't. And so, in my book, in my normal conversations, I tend to use the word vulnerability to mean purely software vulnerabilities, defects, known defects in software. And I use the word opportunity to talk about the bigger picture of ways you can be attacked. And, Mark, he's a guru in this space. He does a bunch of this stuff instinctively. But this is how I interpret the answer he just gave us. A few minutes ago, Mark, I heard you talk about threat. Threat was intent times capability times opportunity. Can you talk about threat? What is threat? How's that formula work?
Okay, so the main thing here is that we're not talking about a product in the metric discussion about the adversary. These are contemporary ideas on how to assign attributes and characteristics to a threat actor, and that happens to be capability, opportunity, and intent. I do not believe that we are talking about elements that you make a product of. It's not a sum or anything like that. These are measurable attributes that help you better understand the adversary, and it's not a product in that. When you look at how an adversary is going to operate, it is safe to say we should start with the assumption that it's all about economics, that there's investments in time and money associated with accomplishing a certain goal. And your point about opportunity versus vulnerability, where the vulnerability, whatever it is, it's something that exists that if capitalized on, it could, under the right conditions, further an adversary towards accomplishing their goal. We could agree on that, right? It's like something that exists in the system, whether it's a misconfiguration or it is a bad software or something. Could we agree on the fact that a vulnerability is something that if capitalized upon, it is a feature of a system that if capitalized on by an adversary could forward their strategy towards accomplishing a negative consequence event? Could we do that?
Absolutely.
All right. So what happens is if you say, let's revisit the concept of vulnerability in the context of opportunity, the theory here in looking at the consequence, starting with the consequence and looking at what the adversary has to do or what the conditions are that need to be met for some sort of attack to be successful, I think it's important to understand the consequences or the conditions, or like really what has to happen. Is it this and this, or is it this or this and this? These are the conditions that need to be met. And in almost every conversation you come up with that the adversary has to, in their kill chain, move from system to system or find a way to root the box or to gain administrative access or to pivot and revisit reconnaissance and things like this. When you look at vulnerability in the context of opportunities for the adversary, the contemporary cyber adversary really looks at trying to find the vulnerabilities that they can exploit and capitalize on. But they don't always have to be vulnerabilities. It could be other things that are not historically vulnerabilities. And the conversation is I'm trying to make here is moving away from vulnerability to opportunity changes the landscape to be a little bit broader in the context of what pre-existing condition needs to be available for the adversary. It may not be a vulnerability. And we have found that consistent focus on only vulnerabilities doesn't necessarily get the defender the common operating picture they need to fully defend their architecture. If it's only vulnerabilities and they're only testing for vulnerabilities and leaving it at that, they may not be getting a complete and concise picture of the landscape of opportunity for the adversary, because what they're looking for, or what the adversary actually needs, isn't by definition a vulnerability according to the defender.
Waterfall Security Solutions is the OT security company. If you're wondering what is the difference between a unidirectional gateway and a firewall, or a so-called unidirectional firewall, then you'll be interested in Waterfall's latest ebook. Firewalls are used throughout both industrial networks and enterprise networks. But best practice demands something stronger, something truly unidirectional at the IT-OT interface. To see the difference that unidirectional security makes, please download the free ebook, Firewalls versus Unidirectional Gateways, from the Waterfall website under the Resources menu.
You know, you touched on multiplication there, multiplying capability and opportunity, and I agree. Multiplying is a strange way of combining these qualitative factors. You know, it seems to me that if you have a threat actor that's capable of taking advantage of a certain situation. I don't know, physically stealing an RSA dongle and, having long since stolen, phished a password and logging in as a support technician at a conference where they've, pickpocketed the support technician. If you've got an adversary that's that capable, then if what you're using is two-factor authentication for your remote access, you're going to go down every time. It's not a question of multiplying the capability times the opportunity. It's a question of, is the capability bigger than the defense? Are the defenses strong enough to keep this class of adversary out? And I've used the word in the past, cyber design basis threat. Is that a better fit here? Can you talk about, what is that and where's it used and does that make any sense here?
Okay, so I'm going to unpack a few things that you said there, because it's, like always, the things you say are extraordinarily brilliant and interesting, and I could go 100 different ways on each end. First of all, one of the things I like to remind people is that when you have the you have the elements of capability, opportunity, and intent, when they all align, you will have an event. Hands down. I mean, you can be guaranteed of that. If capability and opportunity and intent all align, you will have an event. The job of the defender is to manage that relationship between capability, opportunity, and intent. You spoke of making sure that you spoke briefly on the adversary who has a capability that is adequate to overcome or take advantage of a certain opportunity, be it a vulnerability or some design feature that they know about that they can take advantage of. And if the intent is to do X, if the capability an adversary has is enough to take advantage of the opportunity, and the taking advantage of that opportunity results in some consequence that aligns directly with the intent, then absolutely you're going to get an event. And I think that needs to be important. And to your suggestion, the job of the defender begins to become, how do I change the things that I can control? I cannot control intent. I cannot control capability. I can control the opportunity landscape. I can control the opportunity landscape because based on what I know as the system designer, doing all these security assessments on the system and knowing all the negative consequence events and what conditions need to be met by happening, what conditions need to be met to allow those negative consequence events to happen, I can control the opportunity landscape to drive the work effort of the adversary up. That's my job. That's where it gets really, really, really interesting, because you can't do that without complete and total stakeholder involvement from across the entire staff of stakeholders in the critical information infrastructure.
Okay, so you talked about capability and opportunity. What I've seen, people do is, design-based threat, is a concept from physical security. But I've heard, boards of directors give a mandate to their CIO, to their execution team, saying, I want this class of threat dealt with. I don't want this class of threat to pose a credible threat to us. Get rid of it. And is that useful? Is that the right way to look at capability and opportunity? Say, I want that opportunity erased.
Yes. Okay. So that in itself is a loaded question. So that kind of initiative by C-level executives or the board is fairly mature, because the assumption is that if I wipe out this class of risk, everything below it is going to disappear. And in many cases, that's actually a fair assumption. The concept of using attack tree modeling and kill chain overlays on attack trees kind of gives a lot of credit to that, because when you look at these attack trees and these models, the assumption is this. The class of adversary I'm worried about has this capability, and these are the conditions that need to be met, and we're worried about this capability of an adversary to be able to do all these things, meet these conditions, and if they do all of this, then these really, really bad things that we're really, really worried about are going to happen. Let's make sure that doesn't happen, and if we can make sure that doesn't happen, then everything else that's low-hanging fruit or risk or threat categories less than what we're worried about will go away. I think that is very useful. I'm not sure that it is useful for every type of entity out there, especially those just taking the first bite out of the proverbial control system cybersecurity or infrastructure cybersecurity apple. But for more mature organizations that have a lot more experience in building their countermeasures, they have gotten to the point saying, okay, we're looking at worst case scenarios now. What are the real bad things that could happen? What are those use cases and scenarios? And can we test in a controlled environment? Can we test ourselves against these types of attacks? And I do believe that there is a time and place for those types of exercises. It is useful to many organizations that are informed enough to know that we have gotten rid of all the low-hanging fruit, but what we're really worried about is this specific category of threat actor. And that leads to the question of your analysis to the design basis threat as for cyber and DBT as a derivative or derived historically in most commonly in the nuclear space. This is the level of reasonable physical protection assurances that that a facility could defend itself against. And then they're not advised who the actual threat is. They're given the characteristics and attributes of the adversary and say, please defend yourself against this. Anything above this, the state or some other government entity will come in to help you. And the facility is often tested on their ability and vetted and verified on their ability to defend themselves up to and including the most significant level of a threat that's presented through design basis threat. I personally think that is an extraordinarily useful and interesting model when you begin to include the cyber component to it, because the basic principles of DBT map very well to cyber, because you're using concepts of condition-based analysis. You are looking at the consequences of what the adversary could do in a worst case scenario, and working backwards to figure out what the conditions are that need to be met to accomplish that really, really bad thing. And then saying, well, if someone is going to accomplish this, they have to have the following characteristics and attributes to be able to pull it off. That's what we're talking about, folding cyber into a more modern conversation about risk analysis and actually giving the credit where credit is due to the metrics associated with how to analyze the threat actor in terms of capability and attributes. Because if you give them capabilities and attributes and saying that this is the bad guy, and for them to accomplish what we know to be a really terrible thing, and what we know that has to happen for that very bad thing to happen, the adversary must be able to do these things. Then you stop the adversary from being successful in doing those very bad things by reviewing the, quote, vulnerability or the opportunity that exists in the target environment and making sure that a said adversary with certain capabilities and attributes just can't do it.
So, Nate, just a few words of explanation here. Mark has mentioned government intervention a couple of times, sort of in passing. In the physical security world, the most sophisticated threats, the most capable threats, tanks rolling down the street, you expect the government to protect us against. You don't expect individual businesses. That doesn't really work in the cyberspace, so this is a problem. This is why we have to talk about, nation states coming after us, because there really isn't a lot the government can do to protect us from them. When we talk about, advanced threats, when we talk about, extreme capabilities, he's mentioned, he talks a lot about kill chain concepts. He doesn't use the term very often, but when he's talking about chains of opportunities and attack trees, you're looking for choke points in the kill chain. And really, to me, the bottom line when we're asking, how do we use this way of looking at risk, capabilities and intent, due diligence, due care means defending, preventing unacceptable consequences due to credible threats. And, the credible threats have capabilities that we can understand. So, when we figure out what are the credible threats, understand their capabilities, we look at the kill chain, we find the choke points to modify the opportunity land space to eliminate those opportunities for those credible threats, for threats that lead to unacceptable consequences. So that's kind of the big picture I'm taking away here. Mark often dives into a lot of the detail. The one thing we haven't dug into is intent. If there's the ability out in the threat ecosystem to take down OT systems. That's been demonstrated repeatedly, even if it allegedly wasn't the intent. The ability is there. There's clearly the ability in some of the threat actors to impair safety systems. This appears to have been their intent, but if you believe the criminals, some of the criminals are saying it wasn't. We don't really mean to kill people at the site. A, can we believe them? B, is intent really relevant here when there's widespread capabilities? What do you do with intent? How is it useful here?
Intent's very useful from the defender perspective. Intent are goals and objectives of the adversary. The intent is what we can look at historical cases. We can have great big arguments on what the intent was for, the Colonial Pipeline attack or the ransomware attacks, that the ransomware wasn't intended to do this. Was it opportunistic? That's we could really spend a lot of time talking about that. Intent, I think, in the conversation is an element that is extraordinarily powerful for the defender. They're the ones who know the system. This is where you get into the conversation about what's the role of the stakeholder south of the firewall that's really trying to understand cybersecurity from the OT world. We really need to do a better job at giving voice to the engineers and the OT stakeholders who can now say, this is what I worry about from a worst case scenario. And a worst case scenario is some event. That event could be the intent of the adversary. The adversary may say, I want to cause physical damage to this system. And you could extrapolate, well, the physical damage to this system means loss of life or impact to funds or things like this. But there's a specific consequence that is the intent. Now, people will argue with that because you get into the realm of how many steps in the kill chain are there? Are there 6? Are there 7? Are there 5? These kind of things. Intent, and again, this is me talking, intent is to be used by from what we would believe the adversary would want to accomplish. Intent is not a final goal. Intent is also associated with what needs to be achieved at certain steps in the attack life cycle. There could be one terminal intent, a final intent for the adversary, saying that the ramifications in the aggregate of all of these smaller consequences results in this big bang or the super negative consequence event that's going to make headlines. Sure. But whatever the intent is, it's actually meant for the assessors or those doing analysis on the system itself to give them the goal of the adversary. What is the intent of the adversary, the terminal goal of the adversary, or the intent of the adversary in each step that would make up somewhere, an element in the kill chain? That's what it's used for. Because if we have the intent, we can make best guess approximations about what the adversary might want to do. Now, intent remains ethereal in the context of what the adversary really wants to do, because there's components of real threat intelligence and real knowledge about how the adversary operates. And you'd have to have real insight into the attacker or the group of attackers doing it to get what their real intent is. And that's fine. But being able to use the knowledge that the defender actually has about the system and being able to realistically assign what a negative consequence event or the intent would be for the adversary, that gets you a lot of mileage in developing the conditions that need to be met to make that intent become a reality. And then it gives you more insight about what the capability of the adversary actually has to be to get there. So that's where I think it's useful.
It's funny, Andrew, Mark is kind of doing everything the opposite way of what I would have expected of someone like him. I would have expected putting high value in numbers and probabilities and stuff that you could put on paper, and not so much in the inferences involved in trying to determine attacker's intent. That seems less concrete to me. So I don't know. Am I wrong? Is everything backwards here?
No, I think you've misinterpreted, Mark. What I hear him saying is that intent is a tool that the defenders use. And intent is what guides an attacker through an attack tree. Intent is what helps the defenders figure out how an attacker might move through an attack tree. And so I think what I heard him say is assume that your attacker has this consequence as their intent. How would they move through the attack tree to reach that consequence? Now assume a different consequence. So if you look at a number of unacceptable consequences, you look at that as sort of the ultimate goal of the attacker. You can use, well, if that's their goal, what would their next goal out have to be? And the one before that would have to be this. And this is how you guide, you can find paths through the attack tree. You can find the choke points. Its intent is that you attribute to an attacker is a tool that you use to navigate the attack tree and find your opportunity choke points is what I heard. Not so much guesswork as to what the nation state really wants to do. So you've talked about using intent or using our understanding of the adversary's intent to design our systems, to find attack paths through our systems that reflect the adversary's intent. I've seen people use intent the opposite way as well. Not say how do we find attack paths that will satisfy what we understand to be the adversary's intent. I've seen them say, which of these attack paths can we ignore because we don't think the adversary has that intent? Is it prudent? Is it prudent to say, I don't think anybody really wants to kill people by sabotaging safety systems, so I don't need to defend my safety systems? Is that prudent given what's been demonstrated in terms of capability?
So that's a great question. The answer is yes, and the answer is no. So first of all, intent becomes very useful. I mean, if you look at intent and just call it goals and objectives, adversarial goals and objectives, it empowers the defender to say, okay, if the adversary wants to cause this to happen, what are all the things that need to happen for that to happen? And then what are all the things that have to happen to allow those things that need to happen for the intent to happen? And then what are all those things that have to happen to allow those things to happen, to allow those things to happen? And you build these trees out. I don't think it's a good idea to negate any of those, because you will ultimately find commonalities in all those scenarios, all those opportunities, all the conditions that need to be met. At some point, the attack trees and the models get down to a point where there is commonality, where you can address root cause issues. And by addressing those root cause issues and those systemic issues, you inherently mitigate a lot of the risk higher above those root cause issues, that if they are capitalized upon by the adversary, the things above it can't happen. And that's a good thing. However, in the context of saying some people just ignore a bunch of the condition-based analysis segments because they don't believe the adversary is going to do that, that's useful. And again, this is me. This becomes very useful and is sort of close to the design basis threat model if the intelligence that you're getting from the reliable sources definitively confirm to you that that sort of capability isn't there, or the adversary isn't going to do these kind of things. Then you could realistically say, okay, I'm going to ignore some of these elements because I have it on good advice that the adversary isn't going to do it. Do I think that's risky? Yes, I do, because the traditional models where that kind of risk mitigation worked was entirely physical, which moved at a different rate, and there was different ways for the intelligence community to really get eyes on to how people were doing physical types of attack. Cyber changes that. The capability to migrate from an insufficient capability to a more than adequate capability for an adversary right now is nothing. It could be procured, it could be trained up, it could be bought, it could be merged. The life cycle from having not enough capability to do something to getting capable of doing something is pretty simple nowadays in the cyber world. Plus, we don't actually have all the wherewithal to discern with accuracy, I don't think, where the attacks are coming from or who the attackers actually are until it happens. And again, I'm not an expert in that space. So to your point, on one hand, I do think that it is risky to ignore a bunch of things that you are told, hey, don't worry about it, it's not going to happen, unless you have extraordinarily good intelligence to say that it's okay to forget about it. I am much more of a fan of crunching out all of the condition-based analysis and consequences in condition-based analysis to figure out where the commonalities are that help get you focused on systemic and root cause issues from which all the major problems are derived, and go specifically at those to help a more impactful, broad sweeping mitigation strategy.
So there are two things in Mark's answer there that stuck out to me. Number one is his point about, as he put it, the life cycle of capability of threat actors, that, back when attacks were presumed to be, physical in nature, we were dealing with something different than today, where just about anyone can, with enough money and resources at their disposal, scale up to become just about as powerful as they want.
That's right. So the formulas we're talking about, consequence times threat, which is capability and opportunity and intent. These formulas came from the world of physical assaults, and Mark's point is that when you apply them, because they have to do with adversaries with intent, it makes sense to apply them to the cyber world, but you have to adapt them because you can buy these capabilities. There was a day, 10, 15 years ago when the nation states, did all of this attack stuff in-house. They had their own employees. They had, buildings or campuses full of buildings, full of people who were doing this advanced attack, tool development, all these advanced attacks. Nowadays, there are ecosystems. in different parts of the world, serving different masters, different agendas. So one example, even in the Western world, even in the world of Western nation states, there's been research done. There's been limited publication of what's going on there. One concrete example is if you want to buy legitimately 0 days, it costs you between $2.5 and $5 million a year. You buy a subscription. For $2.5 million, you get a list of 25 0 days that you can use in your attacks. And as those 0 days become not 0 days, they become discovered, security updates are issued for them. They're taken off the list and replaced with another 0 day. So you subscribe to these things at a cost of about $100,000 a 0 day. And there's again reports out there that there's comparable ecosystems in other parts of the world. There's comparable ecosystems in the underground. If you want to buy advanced attack capabilities, there is a marketplace for them right now. So he's absolutely right.
The other thing I've been sitting on is, you two are talking a lot about interpreting intent of threat actors, imagining what they could do, what they would want to do, and then using that information to, go through the attack chain and patch up and close up what needs to be patched up and closed up. But to me, this basically sounds like red teaming. I recall maybe we discussed penetration testing perhaps with Jonathan Paulet a while back. And when we did, Andrew, if I remember correctly, you had a bit of a critique of penetration testing used in the wrong ways because, a pen tester can go through your systems, find some really complex route towards the heart of what you've got, and boom, you've got one attack path that you could then patch up, but then of course you've got hundreds of others that they didn't actually leverage in that one attack, and you think you're covered, but you're actually not. To your mind, what is the difference between that kind of cybersecurity and what we're talking about here? What is the right way to sort of do this red teaming, whether it's in practice through penetration testing or in theory through interpreting attackers' intent?
Yeah, so don't get me wrong. I'm not I'm not a critic of penetration testing. Penetration testing is very important. It's very valuable in certain contexts. So one thing that penetration testing does really well is it shakes the money loose. Shock and awe. You bring in a pen tester 2 days into the test. They're into the system. They've compromised everything. Any questions? Yeah. How do we prevent that from happening again? Or you have a very sophisticated, defensive posture. You bring in a pen tester as part of sort of due diligence. They hack at it for 3.5 weeks and they finally get in. Okay, we're not as tough as we thought we were. Let's go back to the drawing board and fix this. But when we sit down either, after 2 days or after 3.5 weeks to fix this, we don't put a Band-Aid over the one attack path that was discovered. We go back to basics and say, how do we make this whole thing stronger? What have we missed systematically? Fix those systematic problems. And the pen testing skill set is even valuable in there. I mean, once you've done the actual attack, you got in, you're done. Now you want to fix the problem. You sit down with the attack trees, you sit down with the attack scenarios. Having a pen tester in the room to help walk through the chains of opportunity that lead to the consequence, walk through all of them, explore all of the ways that we're vulnerable, that we're open to attack. That's a very valuable skill set to have in the room. But now they're doing the work on paper rather than, with Nmap and ARP-ping. Thank you so much. Can you wrap this up? Is there a thought, is there a summary or a thought you can leave with our listeners here?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting to know that this entire conversation about breaking down the attributes and characteristics of the threat actor for capability, opportunity, intent isn't necessarily derived from a cybersecurity discussion or like an OT cybersecurity discussion. It's actually concepts that came from the engineering community, the stakeholders who were challenged with trying to understand what else could be analyzed that would help them better understand the risk associated with control system cybersecurity. And the conversation was stemmed from their needing to have more things to talk about regarding the actual people they're defending against, right? They can't control consequence. They can't control what bad guys want to do, but what would they have to be capable of to do it? What would they have to know? What skills would they actually have to have? And that ultimately began the conversation about how to distill metrics in the risk conversation specific to the adversary, and then what the adversary would need to do to take advantage in certain instances, which gets you the conversation of opportunity. So it's nice to know that the genesis for all of this actually came from stakeholders south of the firewall in the engineering community trying to better understand how to address the most important things for the systems they need to protect.
That was your interview with Mark Fabro. Andrew, how about a last word to take us out?
Yeah, so Nate, as I said at the beginning, I am writing a book on this topic. I found this interview with Mark very useful. The bottom line is that sort of the modern sophisticated understanding of cyber risk, of OT cyber risk, involves consequences and intent and capabilities and opportunities. We don't multiply these things together, but we need to take them into account in figuring out the risk and what we're going to do about it. So the bottom line is, what is due care? What do we, as people responsible for cybersecurity in the OT space, what do we have to do? What is the minimum standard of due care? To me, the bottom line is this: there are widely available attack capabilities. Due care is making sure that there's no path of intent and opportunity that leads from widely available attack capabilities into the consequences we've decided are unacceptable.
Okay. Thanks to Mark Fabro for speaking with you, Andrew. And as always, Andrew, thank you for speaking with me.
Always a pleasure. Thank you, Nate.
This has been the Industrial Security Podcast from Waterfall. Thanks to everybody listening.